All right. Greetings and good evening. This is a late one. Welcome. My name is Imuna Yisrael. It is on the 9 o'clock hour. Greetings to those who have just joined us. This is an extension of Take Time to Heal as we're reading from the LEV Project, the narratives of our foreparents who have came before us, and some have gone through what at that time, and I keep saying it, was a revolutionary act of sharing their voice at a time where it wasn't as common as it is today. You know, when you think about stuff like texting and emails, and I actually read something today out of another book as I'm reading the stories, and the elder said, you know, his name was Albert. He said, if the master caught you with a paper and pen, or if he caught you praising out loud, it would be a problem. And he didn't have to worry about getting in trouble because he neither praised out loud, and I'm paraphrasing, nor did he use paper and pen. I thought that was very interesting as he tied his survival and whether or not he was abused, whether or not he was beat, to complying to rules that today we would look at our children like they were crazy if they came and said that, So the total opposite, contrary to a normal thought process, they were rewarded, quote unquote, or not abused for remaining ignorant. I'll let that marinate for a little bit. I'm sharing this thing on social media. Once again, welcome. My name is Imuna Yisrael. It's late in the evening, so you already know how it goes. If anybody desires to read, I notice a lot of people are catching it on the replay, and that's beautiful. If you want to, I don't have it so, what's the word I'm looking for? So tightly in a schedule, you understand? As time permits and allows, I'm able to come forward. I try to give enough warning ahead of time, earlier in the day that we're going to be reading. So definitely, if you want to participate and you want to let your voice be heard, I'll keep reading till somebody wants to read. It's all good for me, because this particular story, as you're hearing it, I'm hearing it also. I'm not going ahead of the story, so I'm kind of waiting to hear as it progresses. And so, one second, let me just share this thing one more time here. And people are giving feedback, mixed reviews. Some are not ready to go into these avenues on and into these places because they're so painful. But I beg to say that there's healing in these places. If we just take the lights off and it was bad, yeah, but to not address it is even worse, you know. So addressing it as you go on, and you have people to speak to and to express your thoughts and not keep it bottled up and kind of work through it, it gets better. It definitely gets better. So thanks all those for joining us. Chapter 9 is a decent little chapter. If you missed chapter 8, it's definitely up there. We went to the urban bookstore here in Cocoa, Florida. I'm up in Cocoa, Florida, because I'm not even close. I'm close, but not that close. But I definitely thought it was beneficial. And if you are in an area, this is not just one area. If you are in an area that you have an urban bookstore, and or you have a group of people who are interested, especially the younger generation, just gather them together. You even can rent little rooms at the library. Sometimes they come for free. Gather together and just resolve to read. Just read. It's as simple as that. I know sometimes they said there's so many things, like I said, about reading out loud is so beneficial. And just read to the youth. Tell them stories, but a lot of times we can't tell them stories because we don't know them ourselves. So let's rediscover them together, and just read. So right about now, I'm about to read. All praise be to the Most High, the Holy One of creation, giving thanks and praise for this day, His blessing and mercy upon our soul. May we understand, may the Creator open up our eyes and desire in our mind and our heart to receive these testimonies and actually process them. And may they help us in understanding what it is that we're going through here in the diaspora. While so many people are crying out for understanding, we have to apply our minds and our heart to that understanding. It doesn't just, jump out of the sky and be like, here I am. It's something that we have to pursue to understand, and then have the humility to actually accept the things that we are hearing so that we can see our way through the other side. So I, for one, um, am super duper excited. Uh, I'll just say one more thing. I was watching recently an elder by the name of Claudette Cloven, and she was I'm not sure if I told this. No, I don't think I told it. She was the first, not really first, but she was before Rosa Parks. But at the time, she was young, and long story short, according to their testimony, she wasn't the poster girl or the ideal thought of what they wanted the boycott to look like. So Rosa Parks came in December. She actually refused to get out of her seat in March or February, I think March, or earlier that year. Long story short, they asked her, why didn't you get up? And she said it was Negro History Month, which at that time, and you could look it up, it wasn't a month, sorry, it was a week. But she said they never taught them their history in school. But she was in a segregated schools, and she had teachers who were vested in her and the class. So they took, instead of the week, they did it for a month, and they taught her about, heroes and heroines from this time that we're reading about. They taught her about different parts within her history, and it gave her an awareness. And in that awareness, she said, well, they picked the wrong day to come to me, because she was feeling strength in understanding who she was. And she said, according to her testimony, it was history that glued her to the seat. I actually posted up there because I just thought it was just so telling. She said it was history that glued her to the seat. Knowing what your foreparents went through, knowing what they fought for, it brings a different level of awareness. And prayerfully, we don't allow ourselves to be so distracted. Some people talk, I don't got no time to be reading all those books. I'm like, dude, you spend like 3-4 hours on Facebook. You spend an hour a day reading. You're way beyond, even if you dedicate, you don't have to spend the whole time stuck in history. But if you don't apply, we don't stop learning. I've never been of the impression that after you finish school, you stop learning. Life is your schoolhouse. You don't have to stop learning. You choose to stop learning. You choose to stop growing. You choose to stop elevating. All of this is right at your fingertips. It is not beyond us. We just have to have the desire to know that we may understand. So with that, again, if anyone has anything or if you like to read, just hit me up on social media. And I'm going to go ahead and start here. Thursday, actually, we were with him as he went into the cotton fields, and we had a discussion with the elders about that experience, his first time in the cotton field, him being a bit competitive with the other pickers. When they say cotton picking, you cotton picking, that's real terminology. They still say a lot of the things that were used as slurs and things of that nature, but it's real life terminology. Thanks for those who have just joined us. I stopped playing the music because YouTube seems to like to flag you when you play the music. So I'm going to talk us up to the time. And so now that we are here, I'm going to get started. All right. This is chapter 8 of, and men, if you're out there, we would love to hear your voice. Definitely, even if whatever it is, if whatever you want to contribute, a paragraph, a page, definitely we'd love to hear this read in the narrative of the masculine tone, being that this is the story of a masculine. I wanted to read the story of the masculine, and later on we're going to read the story of feminine principles experienced in slavery. So prayerfully, before the end of this book, we have a man volunteer to read something. 50 Years in Chains, or The Life of an American Slave by Charles Bohr, chapter 9. It says, it is impossible to reconcile the mind of the native slave to the idea of living in a state of perfect equality and boundless affection with white people. I'm sorry, let me read that one again. It is impossible to reconcile the mind of the native slave to the idea of living in a state of perfect equality, endless and boundless affection with the white people. Heaven will be no heaven to him if he is not to be avenged of his enemies. I know from experience that these are the fundamental rules of his religious creed, because I learned them in the religious meetings of the slaves themselves. A favorite and kind master or mistress may now and then be admitted into heaven, but this rather as a matter of favor to the intercession of some slave than a matter of strict justice to the whites, who will by no means be of an equal rank with those who shall be raised from the depths of misery in this world. The idea of a revolution in the conditions of the whites and the blacks is the cornerstone of the religion of the latter. And indeed, seems to me, at least to the quite natural, if not in strict accordance with the precepts of the Bible, for in that book I find it everywhere laid down that those who have possessed an inordinate position of the good things of the world and have lived in ease and luxury at the expense of their fellow men will surely have to render an account of their stewardship and be punished for having withheld from others the participation of those blessings which they themselves enjoy. There is no subject which presents to the mind of the male slave a greater contrast between his own condition and that of his master. Interesting. Let me read that again. Sorry. There is no subject which presents to the mind of the male slave a greater contrast between his own condition and that of his master than the relative station and appearance of his wife and his mistress. The one poorly clad, poorly fed, and exposed to all the hardships of the cotton field, the other dressed in clothes of gay and various colors, ornamented with jewelry, and carefully protected from the rays of the sun and blasts of the wind. As I have before observed, the Africans have feelings peculiar to themselves, but with an American slave, the possession of the spacious house, splendid furniture, and fine horses of his master are but the secondary objects of his desire. To fill the measure of his happiness and crown his highest ambition, his young and beautiful mistress must adorn his triumph and enliven his hopes. I have been drawn into the above reflection by the recollection of an event of most melancholy character, which took place when I had been on this plantation about 3 months. Amongst the house servants of my master was a young man named Hardy, of a dark yellow complexion, a quadroon or mulatto, 1/4 of whose blood was transmitted from white parentage. Hardy was employed in various kinds of work about the house and was frequently sent on errands, sometimes on horseback. I had become acquainted with the boy, who had often come to see me at the quarter, and had sometimes stayed all night with me, and often told me of the ladies and gentlemen who visit at the great house. Amongst others, he frequently spoke of a young lady who resided 6 or 7 miles from the plantation, and often came to visit the daughters of the family, in company with her brother, a lad about 12 or 14 years of age. He described the great beauty of this girl, whose mother was a widow, living on a small estate of her own. This lady did not keep a carriage, but her son and daughter, when they went abroad, traveled on horseback. On Sunday, these two young people came to visit at the house of my master and remained till after tea in the evening. As I did not go out to work that day, I went over to the great house, and from the house to a place in the woods about a mile distance, where had set snares for rabbits. This place was near the road, and I saw the young lady and her brother on their way home. It was after sundown when they passed me, but as the evening was clear and pleasant, I supposed they would get home soon after dark, and that no accident would befall them. No more was thought of the matter this evening, and I heard nothing further of the young people until the next day about noon, when a black boy came into the field where we were picking cotton and went to the overseer with a piece of paper. In a short time, the overseer called me to come with him, and leaving the field with hands under the order of Simon, the first captain, we proceeded to the great house. For those who just joined us, we are reading chapter 9 of 50 Years in Slavery. As soon as we arrived, 50 years in chains. Sorry about that. As soon as we arrived at the mansion, my master, who had not spoken to me since the day we came from Columbia, appeared at the front door and ordered me to come in and follow him. He led me through a part of the house and passed into the backyard, where I saw the young gentleman, his son, another gentleman who I did not know, the family doctor, and the overseer all standing together and in earnest conversation. At my appearance, the overseer opened a cellar door and ordered me to go in. I had no suspicion of evil. Wow, I don't know what's about to happen. And obeyed the order immediately, as indeed I must have obeyed it, whatever might have been my suspicions. The overseer and the gentleman all followed, and as soon as the cellar door was closed after us by someone I could not see, I was ordered to pull off my clothes and lie down on my back. I was then bound by hands and feet with strong cords and extended at full length between two of the beams and supported of the beams that supported the timbers of the building. The stranger, who I now observed was much agitated, spoke to the doctor, who then opened a small case of surgeon's instruments, which he took from his pocket, and told me he was going to skin me for what I had done last night. But, said the doctor, before you are skinned, you had better confess your crime. What crime, master, shall I confess? I have committed no crime. What has been done that you are going to murder me? Was my reply. My master then asked me why I had followed the young lady and her brother who went from the house the evening before and murdered her. Astonished and terrified at the charge of being a murderer, I knew not what to say, and only continued the protestations of my innocence and my entreaties not to be put to death. My young master was greatly enraged against me and loaded me with maledictions and imprecations, and his father appeared to be as well satisfied as he was of my guilt, but was more calm and less vociferous in his language. The doctor during this time was a sort, they got some crazy child going on here. They just like pull you up and just, the doctor during this time was assorting his instruments and looking at me. Then stooping down and feeling my pulse, he said, it would not do to skin a man so full of blood as I was. I should bleed so much that he could not see to do his work, and he would probably cut some large vein or artery, by which I should bleed to death in a few minutes. It was necessary to bleed me in the arms for some time so as to reduce the quantity of blood that was in me before taking my skin off. Are they serious? He then bound a string around my right hand and opened a vein near the middle of my arm, from which the blood ran in a large and smooth stream. I already began to feel faint with the loss of blood when the cellar door was thrown open and several persons came down with 2 lighted candles. I looked at these people attentively as they came near and stood around me and expressed their satisfaction at the just and dreadful punishment that I was about to undergo. Their faces were all new and unknown to me, except that of a lad whom I recognized as the same one who had ridden by me and the preceded evening in the company with his sister. The old master spoke to this boy by name and told him to come and see the murderer of his sister receive his due. The boy was a pretty youth and wore his hair long on the top of his head in the fashion of that day. As he came round near my head, the light of the candle which the doctor held in his hand shone full in my face, and seeing that the eyes of the boy met mine, I determined to make one more effort to save my life, and said to him in as calm a tone as I could, young master, did I murder your mistress, your sister? The youth immediately looked at my master and said, this is not the man. This man has short wool, and he had long wool like your Hardy. My life was saved. I was snatched from the most horrible of tortures and from a slow and painful death. I was unbound, the bleeding of my hand stopped, and I was suffered to put on my clothes and go up into the backyard of the house, where I was required to tell what I knew of the young lady and her brother of the previous day. I stated that I had seen them in the courtyard of the house at the time I was in the kitchen, that I had then gone to the woods to set my snares and had seen them pass along the road near me, and that this was all the knowledge I had of them. The boy was then required to examine me particularly and ascertain whether I was or was not the man who had murdered his sister. He said he had not seen me at the place where I stated I was, and that he was confident I was not the person who had attacked him and his sister. That my hair, or wool, as he called it, was short, but of the man who committed the crime was long, like Hardy's. Why you keep calling out Hardy? You know what I'm saying? I'm sorry, people. But but also just join us. This is the LEV project. We're reading what's this? Chapter 9. My name is Amuna Yisrael. Please excuse me if you hear some outbursts because look like he's trying to implicate Hardy here. Someone now asks where Hardy was, see? And he was called for, but could not be found in the kitchen. Persons were sent to the quarter and other places in quest of him, but returned without him. Hardy was nowhere to be found. Whilst this inquiry, or rather search, was going on, perceiving that my old master had ceased to look upon me as a murderer, I asked him to please to tell me what had happened that had been so near proving fatal to me. I was now informed that the young lady who had left the house on the previous evening in the company with her brother had been assailed on the road about 4 miles off by a black man who had sprung from a thicket and snatched her from her horse as she was riding a short distance behind her brother. That the assassin, as soon as she was on the ground, struck her horse a blow with a long stick, which together with the fright caused by the screams of its rider, when torn from it, had caused it to fly off at full speed, and the horse of the brother also taking fright, followed in pursuit, notwithstanding all the exertions of the lad to stop it. All the account the brother could give of the matter was that as his horse ran with him, he saw the negro drag his sister into the woods and heard her screams for a short time. He was not able to stop his horse until he reached home, when he gave information to his mother and her family that people had been scourging the woods all night and all morning without being able to find the young lady. When intelligence of this horrid crime was brought to the house of my master, Hardy was the first to receive it. He having gone to take the horses, sorry, he having gone to take the horse of the person, a young gentleman of the neighborhood who bore it, and who immediately returned to join his friends in their search for the dead body. As soon as the messenger was gone, Hardy had come to my sister and told him that if he would prevent me from murdering him, he would disclose the perpetrator of the crime. He was then ordered to communicate all he knew on the subject and declared that, having gone into the woods the day to hunt squirrels, he stayed until it was late, and on his return home, hearing the shrieks of a woman, he had proceeded cautiously to the place. But before he could arrive at the spot, the cries had ceased. Nevertheless, he had found me after some search with the body of the young, oh no, Hardy didn't. Sorry, with the body of the young lady whom I had just killed. And I was about to kill him too with a hickory club. But he had saved his life by promising that he would never betray me. He was glad to leave me, and what I had done with the body he did not know. Seriously. Hardy was known in the neighborhood, and his character had been good. I was a stranger and on inquiry. The black people in the kitchen supported Hardy by saying that I had been seen going to the woods before night by the way of the road which the deceased and had traveled. These circumstances were deemed conclusive against me by my master, and as an offense of which I was believed to be guilty was the highest that can be committed by a slave, according to the opinions of owners. It was determined to punish me in a way unknown to the law, and to inflict tortures upon me, which the law could not tolerate. I was now released, and though very weak from the effects of bleeding, I was yet able to return to my own lodgings. Hardy set him up. I had no doubt that Hardy was the perpetrator of the crime, for which I was so near losing my life, and now recollected that when I was at the kitchen of the great house on Sunday, he had disappeared a short time before sundown, as I had looked for him when I was going to set my snares, but could not find him. I went back to the house and communicated this fact to my master. By this time, nearly 20 white men had collected about the dwelling with the intention of going to search for the body of the lost lady, but it was now resolved to make the lookout double and to give it twofold character of a pursuit of the living as well as seeking for the dead. I now returned to my lodgings in the quarter and soon fell into a profound sleep, from which I did not awake until long after night, when all was quiet and the stillness of the undisturbed tranquility prevailed over our little community. I felt restless and sunk into a labyrinth of pain, reflections upon the horrid and perilous condition from which I had this day escaped, as it seemed merely by chance, and I slept until all sensations of drowsiness had left me. I rose from my bed and walked out by the light of the moon, which was now shining. After being in the open air some time, I thought of snares I had set on Sunday evening and determined to go and see if they had taken any game. I sometimes caught opossums in my snares, and as these animals were very fat at this season of the year, I felt the hope that I might be fortunate enough to get one tonight. Unclean. Sorry, he didn't want to eat possum. I had been at my snares and had returned as far as the road near where I had seen the young lady and her brother on horseback on Sunday evening, and had seated myself under the boughs of the holly bush that grew there. It so happened that the place where I sat was in the shade of the bush, within a few feet of the road, but screened from it by some small boughs. In this position, which I had taken by accident, I could see a great distance along the road towards the end of my master's lane. Though covered as I was by the shade and enveloped in boughs, it was difficult for a person in the road to see me. The occurrence that had befallen me in the course of the previous day had rendered me nervous and especially susceptible of all the emotions of fear. I had not been long in the place when I thought I heard sounds as of a person walking on the ground at a quick pace. And looking along the road towards the lane, I saw the form of someone passing through a space in the road, where the beams of the moon piercing between two trees reached the ground. When the moving body passed into the shade, I could not see it, but in a short time, it came so near that I could distinctly see that it was a man approaching me by the road. When he came opposite me and the moon shone full in his face, I knew him to be a young mulatto named David, the coachman of a widow lady who resided somewhere near Charleston, but who had been at the house of my master for 2 or 3 weeks as a visitor with her 2 daughters. This man passed on a quick step without observing me, and the suspicion instantly riveted in my mind that he was the murderer, for whose crime I had already suffered so much, and that he was now on his way to the place where he had left the body, for the purpose of removing or burying it in the earth. I was confident that no honest purpose could bring him to this place, and at this time of night alone. I was about 2 miles from home and an equal distance from the spot where the girl had been seized. For those who have just joined us, this is I'm all into the story, sorry. This is 50 Years in Chains, and we're on chapter 9. At the end of this discussion, as usual, we will have a discussion about what we're reading. So once again, welcome. And it's getting juicy right about now. We're trying to find out who the murderer is of this event. 1 second. Of her subsequent murder, no one entertained a doubt, for it was not to be expected that the fellow who had been guilty of one great crime would flinch from the commission of another of equal magnitude and suffer his victim to exist as a witness to identify his person. And he's shook, like, he's afraid he might do me in too. I felt animated by a spirit of revenge against the wretch, whoever he might be, who had brought me so near to torture and death. And feeble and weak as I was, resolved to pursue the footsteps of this coachman at a wary and cautious distance, and ascertain, if possible, the object of his visit to these woods at this time of night. Oh, I'm sorry for those who have just joined us on the line. I've been reading this whole time on the line on mute. So for those who are on the conference call, my many apologies that the phone was on mute this whole time. Sorry about that. That's why they were popping off and popping on. For those who are on the live stream, thank you for joining us. And I just realized that the phone was on mute. I waited until he had passed me more than 100 yards, and until I could barely discover his form in the faint light of the deep shade of the trees, when stealing quietly into the road, I followed with the caution of a spy traversing the camp of an enemy. We were now in dark pine forests, and on both sides of us were tracts of low, swampy ground, covered with thickets so dense as to be difficult of penetration, even by a person on foot. The road led along a neck of the elevated and dry ground that divided these swamps for more than a mile, when they terminated and were succeeded by ground that produced scarcely any other timber than scrubby kind of oak called blackjack. It was amongst these blackjacks, about a half a mile beyond the swamps, that the lady had been carried off. I had often been there for the purpose of snaring and chopping the small game of these woods, and was well acquainted with the topography of this forest for some distance of both sides of the road. He's like wilding out, right? He's in the middle of the night. It was necessary for me to use the utmost caution in the enterprise. I was now engaged in the road I was now engaged in. The road we were now traveling was in no place very broad, and at some place barely wide enough to permit a carriage to pass between the trees that lined the sides. In some places it was so dark I could not see the man whose steps I followed, but was obliged to depend upon the sound produced by the tread of his feet upon the ground. I deemed it necessary to keep as close as possible to the object of my pursuit, lest he should suddenly turn into the swamp on one side or the other of the road and elude my vigilance. For I had no doubt that he would quit the road somewhere. As we approached the termination of the low grounds, my anxiety became intense, lest he should escape me, and at once I could not have been more than 100 feet behind him. But he continued his course until he reached the oak woods and came to a place where an old cart road led off to the left along the side of the dark swamp, as it was termed in the neighborhood. The road the mulatto took without turning to look behind him. Here my difficulties and perils increased, for I now felt myself in danger, as I had no longer any doubt that I was on the trails of the murderer, and that if discovered by him, my life would be the price of my curiosity. I was too weak to be able to struggle with him for a minute, though if the blood which I had lost through his wickedness could have been restored to my veins, I could have seized him by the neck and strangled him. The road I now had traveled was so little frequented that bushes on the ground, oak and bilberry, stood thick in almost every part of it. In almost every part of it. Many of these bushes were full of dry leaves, which had been touched by the frost, but had not yet fallen. It was easy for me to follow him, for I pursued by the noise he made amongst these bushes. But it was not easy for me to avoid, on my part, the making of a rustle and agitation of the bushes, which might expose me to detection. I was now obliged to depend wholly on my ears to guide my pursuit, my eyes being occupied in watching my own way to enable me to avoid every object, the touching of which was likely to produce sound. I followed this road more than a mile, led by the crackling of sticks or the shaking of the leaves. At length, I heard a loud, shrill whistle, and then a total silence succeeded. I now stood still, and in a few seconds heard a noise in the swamp like the drumming of a pheasant. Soon afterwards, I heard the breaking of sticks and the sounds caused by the bending of branches of trees. In a little time, I was satisfied that something having life was moving in the swamp and coming towards the place where the mulatto stood. This was the end of the cart road, and opposite some large pine trees which grew in the swamp, at the distance of 200 or 300 yards from its margin. The noise in the swamp still approached us, and at length a person came out of the thicket and stood for a minute or more with the mulatto whom I had followed, and then they both entered the swamp and took the course of the pine trees, as I could easily distinguish by my ears. When they were gone, I advanced to the end of the road and sat down upon a log to listen to their progress through the swamp. At length, it seemed that they had stopped, for I no longer heard anything of them. Anxious, however, to ascertain more of this mysterious business, I remained in silence on the log, determined to stay there until day, if I could not sooner learn something to satisfy me. Why these men had gone into the swamp? All uncertainty upon this subject was, however, quickly removed from my mind, for within less than 10 minutes after I had ceased to hear them moving in the thicket, I was shocked by the faint but shrill wailings of a female voice, accompanied with explanation and supplications, in a tone so feeble I could only distinguish a few solitary words. This thing is getting juicy for those who have just joined us. Sorry about the mute on the phone. We are getting deep into chapter 9. We might have to split chapter 9 up because chapter 9 is kind of deep. But I'm going to read it so far as I can. And if anyone desires to read, just hit me up on social media and we can arrange that definitely. Let me make sure here. 1 second. All right. So he hears a female voice in the bush. He's trying to find out who murdered this European girl. And he's hearing this faint female voice. Where am I here? My mind comprehended the whole ground of this matter. At a glance, the lady supposed to have been murdered on Sunday evening was still living and concealed by the two fiends who had passed out of my sight but a few minutes before. The one I knew, for I had examined his features within a few feet of me in the full light of the moon, and the other was Hardy. I was as perfectly convinced as if I had been seeing him also. Sorry, he says, I was as perfectly convinced as if I had seen him also. I now rose to return home, the cries of the female in the swamp still continuing, but growing weaker and dying away as I receded from the place where I had sat. That's why they couldn't find no body. I was now in possession of the clearest evidence of the guilt of the two murderers, but I was afraid to communicate my knowledge to my master, lest he should suspect me of being an accomplice in this crime. And if the lady could not be recovered alive, I had no doubt that Hardy and his companion were sufficiently depraved to charge me as participation with themselves to be avenged upon me. I was confident that the mulatto David would return to the house before day and found in his bed in the morning, which he could easily do, for he slept in a part of the stable loft under pretense of being near the horses of his mistress. I thought it possible that Hardy might also return home that night and endeavor to account for his absence from home on Monday afternoon by some ingenious lie, in the invention of which I knew him to be very expert. In this case, I saw that I should have to run the risk of being overpowered by the number of many false accusers, and as I stood alone, they might yet be able to sacrifice my life and escape the punishment due to their crimes. After much consideration, I came to resolution of returning as quick as possible to Thither Quarter, calling upon the overseer and acquainting him with all I had seen, heard, and done in the course of this night. This guy is so trusting. Let me go back over here. As I did not know what time of night it was when I left my bed, I was apprehensive that day might break before I could so far mature my plans as to have persons to lay wait and arrest the mulatto on his return home. But when I aroused the overseer, he told me it was only 1 o'clock and seemed but little inclined to credit my story. But after talking to me several minutes, he told me now more than ever suspected me to be the murderer. You thought that. But after talking to me several minutes, he told me he now more than ever suspected me to be the murderer, but he would go with me and see if I had told the truth. When he arrived at the great house, some members of the family had not yet gone to bed, having been kept up by the arrival of several gentlemen who had been searching the woods all day for the lost lady, and who had come here to seek lodging where it was near midnight. My master was in bed, but was called upon and listened attentively to my story, at the close of which he shook his head and said with an oath, I believe you to be the murderer, but will go and see if all you say is a lie. If it is, the torments of will be pleasure to what awaits you. You have escaped once, but you will not get off a second time. I've now found that somebody must die. And if the guilty could not be found, the innocent would have to atone for them. The manner in which my master had believed his words assured me that the life of somebody must be taken. And they didn't even find no dead body. Sorry. This new danger aroused my energies, and I told them I was ready to go and take the consequences. Accordingly, the overseer, my young master, and 3 other gentlemen immediately set out with me. It was agreed that we would all travel on foot, the overseer and I going a few paces in advance of the others. We proceeded silently but rapidly on way, and as we passed it, I showed them the place where I sat under the holly bush when the mulatto passed me. We neither saw nor heard any person on the road, and reached the log at the end of the cart road, where I sat when I heard the cries in the swamp. All was now quiet, and our party lay down in the bushes on each side of the large gum tree, at the root of which the two murderers stood when they talked together, before they entered the thickets. We had not been here more than 1 hour when I heard, as I lay with my head near the ground, a noise in the swamp, which I believe could only be made by those whom we sought. I, however, said nothing, and the gentleman did not hear it. It was caused, as I afterwards ascertained, by dragging the fallen branch of a tree along the ground for the purpose of lighting a fire. The night was very clear and serene, its silence only being broken at intervals by the loud hooting of the great long-eared owls, which are numerous in these swamps. I felt oppressed by the cold and was glad to hear the crowing of a cock at a great distance, announcing the approaching day. This was followed after a short interval by crackling of sticks and by other tokens which I knew could proceed only from the motions of living bodies. I now whispered to the overseer who lay near me that it would soon appear whether I had spoken the truth or not. All were now satisfied that the people were coming out of the swamp, for we heard them speaking to each other. I desired the overseer to advise the other gentlemen to let the culprits come out of the swamp and gain the high ground before we attempted to seize them. But this counsel was unfortunately not taken, and when they came near to the gum tree, it could be clearly seen that they were two men and no more. One of the gentlemen called out to them to stop, or they were dead. Instead, however, of stopping, they both sprang forward and took to flight. They did not turn into the swamp, for the gentleman who ordered them to stop was in their rear, they having already passed him. At the moment they had started to run, each of the gentlemen, they don't listen, fired 2 pistols at them. The pistol made the forest ring on all sides, and I suppose it was impossible for either of the fugitives to escape from so many balls. This was, however, not the case, for one of them was injured, the mulatto, David, who had one arm and one leg broken and fell about 10 yards from us, but Hardy escaped. And when the smoke cleared away, he was nowhere to be seen. One being interrogated, David acknowledged that the lady was in the swamp on a small island and was yet alive, that he and Hardy had gone from the house on Sunday for the purpose of waylaying and carrying her off, and intended to kill her little brother, this part of the duty being assigned to him, whilst Hardy was to drag the sister from her horse. As they were both mulattoes, they blacked their face with charcoals taken from a pine stump partially burned. The boy was riding before his sister, and when Hardy seized her and dragged her from her horse, she screamed and frightened both the horses, which took off at full speed, by which means the boy escaped. Finding that the boy was out of his reach, David remained in the bushes until Hardy brought the sister to him. They immediately tied a handkerchief around her face so as to cover her mouth and stifle her shrieks, and taking her in their arms, carried her back toward my master's house for some distance through the woods until they came to the cart road leading along the swamp. They then followed this road as far as it led and turned into the swamp, took their victim to a place they had prepared for her Sunday before, on a small knoll in the swamp where the ground was dry. Her hands were closely confined, and she was tied by the feet to a tree. He said he had stolen some bread and taken it to her that night, but when they bound her mouth to permit her to eat, she only wept and made a noise, begging them to release her until they were obliged again to bandage her mouth. It was now determined by the gentleman that as the lady was still alive, we ought not to lose a moment in endeavoring to rescue her from her dreadful situation. I pointed out the large pine trees in the direction of which I heard the cries of the young lady, and near which I believed she was, undertaking at the same time to act as a pilot in penetrating the thicket. 3 of the gentlemen and myself accordingly set out, leaving the other 2 with the wounded mulatto with direction to inform us when we deviated from a right lane in the pine trees. This they were able to do by attending to the noise we made, with nearly as much accuracy as if they had seen us. The atmosphere had now become a little cloudy, and the morning was very dark, even in the oak woods. But when we had entered the thickets of the swamp, all objects became utterly invisible, and the obscurity was as total as if our eyes had been closed. Our companions on the dry ground lost sight of the pine trees and could not give us any direction in our journey. We became entangled in the briars and vines and mats of bushes, from which the greatest exertions were necessary to disengage ourselves. It was so dark that we could not see the fallen trees, and missing these fell in quagmires and sloughs of mud and water, into which we sunk up to the armpits, and from which we were able to extricate ourselves only by seizing upon hanging branches of surrounding trees. After struggling in this half-drowned condition for at least quarter of an hour, we reached a small dry spot where the gentlemen again held a council as to the ulterior measures. They called to those left on shore to show if we were proceeding toward the pine trees, but received for answers that the pines were invisible and they knew not whether we were right or wrong. In this state of uncertainty, it was thought most prudent to wait the coming of the day in our present resting place. The air was frosty, and in our wet clothes, loaded as we were with mud, it may be imagined that our feelings were not pleasant. And when the day broke, it brought us but little relief, for we found as soon as it was light enough to enable us to see around that we were no one of those insulated dry spots called tussocks by the people of the South. These tussocks are formed by clusters of small trees which, taking root in the mud, are in process of time surrounded by long grass, which entwined its roots with those of the trees, overspread and cover the surface of the muddy foundation by which the superstructure is supported. These tussocks are often several yards in diameter, that upon which we now were, stood in the midst of a great miry pool, into which we were again obliged to launch ourselves and struggle onward for a distance of 10 yards before we reached the line of some falling and decaying trees. It was now a broad daylight, and we saw the pine trees at the distance of about 100 yards from us. But even with the assistance of light, we had great difficulty in reaching them, to do which we were compelled to travel at least a quarter of a mile by the angles and curves of the falling timber, upon which alone we could walk, this part of the swamp being vast, half-fluid bog. It was sunrise when we reached the pines, which we found standing upon a small islet of firm ground, containing, as well as I could judge, about half an acre, covered with heavy growth of white maple, swamp oaks, a few large pines, and a vast mat of swamp laurel, called in the South ivy. I had no doubt that the object of our search was somewhere on this little island, but small as it was no trifling affair to give every part of it a minute examination, for the stems and branches of the ivy were so minutely interwoven with each other and spread among the ground in so many curves and crossings that it was impossible to proceed a single rod without lying down and creeping along the earth. For those who just joined us, we are reading chapter 9. They're on the search of the supposedly dead, now missing woman, European, who was captured by two mulattoes. Don't know what they wanted to do with her. Give me one moment as I take a drink of water. All right, let me make sure I'm checking here. Everything is good, and then I shall continue. So, all right. Let me go back over here now. All right, now. It was sunrise when we reached the pines. No, I read that already. The gentleman agreed that if anyone discovered the young lady, he should immediately call to the others, and we all entered the thicket. I, however, turned along the edge of the island with the intention of making its circuit, for the purpose of tracing, if possible, the footsteps of those who had passed between it and main shore. I made my way more than half round the island without much difficulty and without discovering any signs of persons having been here before. But in crossing the trunk of a large tree which had fallen, and the top which extended far into the ivy, I perceived some stains of mud on the bark of the log. Looking into the swamp, I saw that the root of this tree was connected with other fallen timber, extending beyond the reach of my vision, which was obstructed by the bramble of the swamp and the numerous evergreens growing here. I now advanced along the trunk of the tree until I reached its topmost branches, and here discovered evident signs of a small trail leading into the thicket of ivy. Creeping along and following this trail by the small bearberry bushes that had been trampled down and had not again risen to an erect position, I was led almost across the island and found that the small bushes were composed quite up to the edge of the vast heap of branches of evergreen trees, produced by the falling of several large juniper cypress trees, which grew in the swamp in a cluster, and having been blown down, had fallen with their tops athwart each other, and upon the almost impervious mat of ivies, which the surface of the island was coated over. He's very descriptive that we've learned thus far, 9 chapters in the story. He seems to, very photographic memory, always looking at his surroundings and very descriptive as he's, so you can actually feel like you're in the swamp right about now. I stood and looked at this mass of entangled green bush, but could not perceive the slightest marks of entrance into its labyrinths. Nor did it seem possible for any creature larger than a squirrel to penetrate it. It now for the first time struck me at a great oversight in the gentlemen that they had not compelled the mulatto David to describe the place where they had concealed the lady. And as the forest was so dense that no communication could be had with the shore, either by word or signs, we could not now procure any information on this subject. I therefore called to the gentlemen who were on the island with me and desired them to come to me without delay. Small as this island was, it was after the lapse of many minutes that the overseer and the other gentlemen arrived where I stood. And when they came, they would have been the subjects of mirthful emotions had not the tragic circumstances in which I was placed banished from my heart, every feeling but that of the most profound melancholy. When the gentlemen had assembled, I informed them of the signs of footsteps that I had traced from the other side of the island, and told them that I believed the young lady lay somewhere under the heap of brushwood before us. This opinion obtained but little credit, because there was no opening in the bush by which anyone could enter. But on going a few paces round the heap, I perceived a small snaggy pole resting on the brush and nearly concealed by it, with the lower end stuck in the ground. The branches had been cut from the pole at this distance of 3 or 4 inches from the main stem, which made it a tolerable substitute for a ladder. I immediately ascended the pole, which led me to the top of the pile, and here I discovered an opening in the brush between the forked top of one of the cypress trees, through which a man might easily pass. Applying my head to this aperture, I distinctly heard a quick and laborious breathing like that of a person in extreme illness, and again called the gentleman to follow me. So now he found a woman, huh? When they came up the ladder, the breathing was audible to all, and one of the gentlemen, whom I now perceived to be the stranger who was with us in my master's cellar when I was bled, slid down into the bark and narrow passage without uttering a word. I confess that some feelings of trepidation passed through my nerves when I stood alone, but now that a leader had preceded me, I followed and glided through the smooth, elastic cypress tops in the bottom of a vast labyrinth of green boughs. When I reached the ground, I found myself in contact with the gentleman who was in advance of me, and near one end of the large, concave, oblong, open face formed by the branches of trees, having been supported and kept along the ground partly by a cluster of very large and strong ivies that grew here, and partly by a young gum tree, which had been bent into the form of an arch by the failing timber. Though we could not see into the leafy cavern from above, yet when we had been in it a few moments, we had light enough to see the objects around us with tolerable clearness. But that which surprised but that which surprised us both greatly was the place was totally silent, and we could not perceive the appearance of any living thing except ourselves. Okay, so they thought they heard some breathing, but they don't see anybody. After we had been here some minutes, our vision became still more distant, and I saw at the other end of the open spaces ashes of wood and some extinguished brands, but there was no smoke. Going to these ashes and stirred them with a stick, I found coals of fire carefully covered over in a hole or six, sorry, or in a hole 6 or 8 inches deep. When he saw the fire, the gentleman spoke to me and expressed astonishment that he heard the breathing no longer. But he had scarcely uttered these words when a faint groan, as if a woman in great pain, was heard to issue apparently from the ground. But a motion of branches on our right assured me that the sufferer was concealed there. The gentleman sprung to the spot, pushed aside the pendant boughs, stooped low beneath the bent ivies, and came out bearing in his hands a delicate female figure. As he turned round and exposed her half-closed eyes and white forehead to the light, he examined. Eternal God, I, Maria, it is you. Is it you? He then pressed her to his bosom and sunk upon the ground, still holding her closely in his embrace. The lady lay motionless in his arms, and I thought she was dead. Her hair hung matted and disheveled from her head. A handkerchief, once white but now soiled with dust and stained with blood, and bound firmly round her head, covering her mouth and chin, and was fastened at the back of her neck by a double knot secured by a ligature of cypress bark. I knew not whom most to pity, the lady who now lay insensible in the arms that still clasped her tenderly, or the unhappy gentleman who had cut the cords from her limbs and the handkerchief from her face. Now sat and silently gazed upon her dead-like countenance. He uttered not a sigh and moved not a joint, but his breath heaved with agony. The sinews and muscle of his neck rose and fell like those of a man in convulsions. All the ligaments of his face were alternately contracted and expanded, as if his last moments were at hand, whilst great drops of sweat rolled down his forehead, as though he struggled against an enemy whose strength was more than human. Now he feeling sorry for them after they tried to do him in. If you have any comments, I'm not sure. There might be a comment section here on the side. This is a lengthy chapter, so if you definitely have any comments, feel free to share them as we're reading here. And I shall continue. I think we're halfway through. Yes, we're halfway through the chapter. An eventful chapter, indeed. He says here, one second. For those who have just joined us, we're reading 50 Years in Chains. Oppressed by the night of so much wretchedness, I turned from its contemplation and called upon the gentleman without, who had all this time been waiting to hear from us, to come up the ladder to the top of the pile of boughs. The overseer was quickly at the top of the opening by which I had descended, and I now informed him that we had found the lady. He ordered me to hand her up, and I desired the gentleman who was with me to permit me to do so, but he refused. And mounting the boughs of the fallen trees and supporting himself by strong branches of the ivies, he quickly reached the place where the overseer stood. He even here refused to part from his charge, but bore her down the ladder alone. He was, however, to oblige to accept aid in conveying her through the swamp to the place where we had left the two gentlemen with the wounded mulatto, whose sufferings, demon as he was, were sufficient to move. Did he just call him a demon? Were sufficient to move the hardest heart. His right arm and left leg were broken, and he had lost much blood before we returned from the island. And as he could not walk, it was necessary to carry him home. We had not brought any horses, and until the lady was recovered, no one seemed to think any more about the mulatto after he was shot down. It was purposed to send for a horse to take David home, but it was finally agreed that we should leave him in the woods where he was until a man could be sent for him with a cart. At the time we left, his groans and lamentations seemed to excite no sympathy in the breast of any, More cruel sufferings yet awaited him. And where is Hardy? Hardy took off, left everybody. The lady was carried home in the arms of the gentleman, and she did not speak until after she was bathed and put in bed in my master's house, as I afterwards heard. I knew she did not speak on the way. She died on the fourth day after her rescue, and before her death related the circumstance of her misfortune, as I was told by a colored woman who attended her in the illness in the following manner. As she was riding in the dusk of the evening at a rapid trot, a few yards behind her brother, a black man sprang from behind a tree close by side of the road, seized her by her riding dress, and dragged her to the ground, but failed to catch the bridle of the horse, which sprang off at full speed. Another Negro immediately came to the aid of the first and said, I could not catch him. We must make haste. They carried her as fast as they could to go to the place where we found her, when they bound her hands and feet and mouth and left her until the next night, and had left her the second morning only a few minutes, when she heard this report of guns. Soon after this, by great effort, she extricated one of her feet from the bark with which she was bound, but finding herself too weak to stand, she crawled as far as she could under the boughs of the trees, hoping that when her assassins returned again, they would not be able to find her and that she might there die alone. Exhausted by the efforts she had made to remove herself, she fell into the stupor of sleep, from which she was aroused by the noise we made when we descended into the cavern. She then supposed us to be her destroyer's return again, lay still and breathed as softly as possible to prevent us from hearing her. But when she heard the voice of gentleman who was with me, the tones of which were familiar to her, she groaned and moved her feet to let us know where she was. The exertion and the idea of horrid condition overcame the strength of her nerves, and when her deliverer raised her from the ground, she had swooned and was unconscious of all things. We had no longer arrived at the house than inquiry was made. Here we go. We had no longer arrived at the house, no sooner arrived at the house than inquiry was made for Hardy. Hardy is the next one, the next accomplice. But it was ascertained in the kitchen that he had not been seen since the previous evening. At nightfall, when he had left the kitchen for the purpose of going to sleep at the stable with David, as he had told one of the black women, and preparation was immediately made to go in pursuit of him. For this purpose, all the gentlemen present equipped themselves with pistols, fowling pieces, and horns, such as are used by fox hunters. Messengers were dispatched around the country to give notice to all the planters within the distance of many miles of the crimes that had been committed and of the escape of one of its perpetrators, with a request to them to come without delay and to join the pursuit intended to be given. Those who had dogs trained to chase thieves were desired to bring them, and a gentleman who lived 12 miles off, who owned a bloodhound, was sent for and requested to come with his dog in all haste. Now they about to put an all-out search on Hardy. In consequence, I suppose, of the information had been given, I was permitted to be present at these deliberations, and though my advice was not asked, I was often interrogating concerning my knowledge of the affair. Soon purposed to go at once with dogs, horses into the woods and traverse the swamp and thicket for the purpose of rousing Hardy from the place of concealment he might have chosen. But the opinion of the overseer prevailed, who thought that from the intimate knowledge possessed of him of all the swamps and coverts in the neighborhood, there would be little hope of discovering him in this manner. The overseer advised them to wait the coming of the gentleman with the bloodhound before they entered the woods, for the reason that if the bloodhound could be made to take the trail, he would certainly find his game before he quitted. If not, thrown off the scent by the men, horses and dogs crossing his course. But if the bloodhound could not take the scent, they might then adopt the proposed plan of pursuit, which has much success as at present. The counsel being adopted, the horses were ordered into the stable, and the gentlemen entered the house to take their breakfast and wait the arrival of the bloodhound. This is getting interesting for those who just joined us. We are hot on the trail, trying to find out where is Hardy, who kidnapped the European girl with the other mulatto David and locked her up in the woods. Nothing was said of mulatto David. He seemed to be forgotten, not a word being spoken by anyone bringing him from the woods. I knew that he was suffering the most agonizing pains, and great as were his crimes, his groans and cries of anguish still seemed to echo in my ears. But I was afraid to make any application in his behalf, lest even yet I might be suspected of participation in his offenses. For I knew that the most horrid punishments were inflicted upon slaves merely on suspicion. As the morning advanced, the number of men and horses in front of my master's mansion increased, and before 10 o'clock, I think there were at least 50, sounds familiar, of each, the horses standing hitched and the men conversing in groups without or assembled together within the house. At length, the owner of the bloodhound came, bringing with him his dog in a chaise drawn by one horse. The harness was removed from the horse, its place supplied by a saddle and bridle, and the whole party set off for the woods. As they rode away, my master, who was one of the company, told me to follow them, but we had proceeded only a little distance when the gentleman stopped, and my master, after speaking with the owner of the dog, told the overseer to go back to the house and get some piece of clothes of Hardy that he may be worn by him lately. Let me read that again. Get some pieces of clothes of Hardy that had been worn by him lately. The overseer returned, and we all proceeded forward to the place where David lay. We found him where we had left him, greatly weakened by the loss of blood, and complaining that cold air caused his wounds to smart intolerably. When I came near him, he looked at me and told me I had betrayed him. You see, we'll talk about this. None of the gentlemen seemed at all moved by his sufferings, and when any of them spoke to him, it was with derision and every epithet of scorn and contumely. I gotta check that word. As it were apparent that he could not escape, no one proposed to remove him to a place of greater safety, but several of the horsemen, as they passed, lashed him with the thongs of their whip. But I do not believe he felt these blows, the pain he endured from his wounds being so great as to drown the sensation of minor affliction. They beat the broke up leg, shot up leg man on the ground. The day had already become warm, although the night had been cold. The sun shone with great clearness, and many carrion crows, attracted by the scent of blood, were perched upon the trees near where we now were. When the overseer came up with us, he brought an old blanket in which Hardy had slept for some time, and handed it to the owner of the dog, who, having first caused the hound to smell of the blanket, untied the cord in which he had been led, and turned him into the woods. The dog went for us 50 or 60 yards in a right line, then made a circle around us again, commenced his circular movement, and pursued it nearly half round. Then he dropped his nose to the ground, snuffed the tainted surface, moved off through the wood slowly, almost touching the earth with his nose. The owner of the dog and 12 of the 15 other followed him, whilst the residue of the party dispersed themselves along the edge of the swamp. And the overseer ordered me, like he's like all up in the thing. Let me change the page here. The overseer ordered me to stay and watch the horses of those dismounted, going himself on foot in the pursuit. When the gentlemen were all gone out of sight, I went to David, who lay all this time within my view, for the purpose of asking him if I could render him any assistance. He begged me to bring him some water, as he was dying of thirst, no less than with the pain of his wounds. One of the horsemen had left a large tin horn handed on his saddle. This I took and stopped the small end closely with leaves, filled it with water from the swamp, and gave it to the wounded man, who drank it, and then turned his head towards me and said, Hardy and I had laid a plan to have this thing brought upon you, and to have you hung for it, but you have escaped. He then asked me if they intended to leave him to die in the woods. That was wicked. Or to take him home and hang him. I told him I heard them talk of taking him home in a cart, but what was to be done with him I did not know. I felt a horror of the crimes committed by this man, was pained by the sight of his suffering, and being unable to relieve the one or to forgive the other, went to a place where I could neither see nor hear him, and sat down to await the return of those who had gone in the pursuit of Hardy. Hmm. It, we're coming to the end of the chapter here. In the circumstances which surrounded me, it could not be supposed that my feelings were pleasant or that time moved very fleetly. But painful as my situation was, I was obliged to bear it for many hours. From the time the gentlemen left me, I neither saw nor heard them until late in the afternoon, when 5 or 6 of them returned, having lost their companions in the woods. Towards sundown, I heard a great noise of horns blown and men shouting at a distance in the forest. And soon after, my master, the owner of the bloodhound, and many others returned, bringing with them Hardy, whom the hound had followed 10 or 12 miles through the swamps and thickets, had at last caught him, and would soon have killed him, but had not been compelled to relinquish his prey. When the party had all returned, a kind of court was held in the woods where we then were, for the purpose of determining what punishment should be inflicted upon Hardy and David. All agreed at once that an example of this most terrific character ought to be made of such atrocious villains, and that it would defeat the ends of justice to deliver these fellows up to civil authority, to be hanged like common murderers. The next measure was to settle upon the kind of punishment to be inflicted upon them and the manner of executing the sentence. Hardy was all this time sitting on the ground, covered with blood, yet bleeding profusely, and hearing of his inex, inex, what is this? Inexorable judges. The dog had mangled both his arms and hands in a shocking manner, torn a large piece of flesh entirely away from one side of his breast, and sunk his fangs deep into the side of his neck. No other human creature that I have ever seen presented more deplorable spectacle of mingled crime and cruelty. It was now growing late, and the fate of these miserable men was to be decided before the company separated to go to their several homes. One purpose to burn them, another to flay them alive, and the third to starve them to death. Many other modes of slowly and tormentingly extinguished life was named, but that which was finally adopted was of all others the most horrible. The wretches were unanimously sentenced to be stripped naked, bound down securely upon their backs on the naked earth inside of each other, to have their mouths closely covered with bandages to prevent them from making a noise to frighten away the birds, and in the manner to be left to be devoured alive by carrion crows and buzzards, which swarm in every part of South Carolina. The sentence was instantly carried into effect so far as its execution depended on us. Hardy and his companion were divested of their clothes, stretched upon their backs on the ground, their mouths bandaged with handkerchiefs, their limbs extended, and these together with their necks being crossed by numerous poles, were kept close to the earth by forked sticks driven into the ground, so as to prevent the possibility of moving any part of their person. And in this manner, these wicked men were left to be torn in pieces by birds of prey. Now that's a wicked punishment. The buzzards and carrion crows always attack dead bodies by pulling out and consuming the eyes first. They then tear open the bowels and feed upon the intestines. We returned to my master's plantation, and I did not see this place again until the next Sunday, when several of my fellow slaves went with me to see the remains of the dead, but we found only their bones. Great flocks of buzzards and carrion crows were assembled in the trees, giving a dismal aspect to the woods, and I hastened to abandon a place fraught with so many afflicting recollections. The lady who had been the innocent sacrifice of the brutality of the men, whose bones I had seen bleaching in the sun, had died on Saturday evening, and her corpse was buried on Monday in a graveyard on my master's plantation. I have never seen a large cotton plantation in California without its burial ground. This burying ground is not only the place of sepulture of the family, who are the proprietors of the estate, but also of many other persons who lived in the neighborhood. Half an acre or an acre of ground is appropriate as a burial ground, on one side of which the proprietors of the estate from age to age are buried, whilst the other parts of the ground are open to strangers, poor people, or their vicinity, and in general to all those who choose to enter their dead within its boundaries. This custom prevails as far north as Maryland, and it seems to me to be much more consonant to the feelings of solitude and tender recollections which we always associate with the memory of departed friends than the practice of promiscuous intermittent in a churchyard where all idea of seclusion is banished. By the last home of the dead being thrown upon, by the last home of the dead being thrown open to the rude intrusions of strangers, where the sanctity of the sepulchre is treated as a common, and where the grave itself is in a few years torn up and covered over to form a temporary resting place for some new tenant. We're coming to the end of it. For those who just joined us, this has been a wild chapter. The family of the deceased lady, though not very wealthy, was amongst the ancient and respectable in this part of the country. And on Sunday, whilst the dead body lay in my master's house, there was a continual influx and efflux of visitors in carriages, on horsebacks, and on foot. One second, let me get a drink of water here. The house was open to all those who chose to come, and the best wines, cakes, sweetmeats, and fruits were handed about the company by the servants, though I observed that none remained for dinner except the relations of the deceased, those of my master's family, and the young gentleman who was with me on the island. The visitors remained but a short time when they came, and were nearly all in mourning. This was the first time that I had seen a large number of fashionable people of Carolina assembled together. And their appearance impressed me with an opinion favorable to their character. I have never seen an equal number of people anywhere whose deportment was more orderly and decorous, nor whose feelings seemed to be more accordant with the solemnity of the event which had brought them together. I had been ordered by the overseer to remain at the great house until the afternoon for the purpose, as I afterwards learned, of being seen by those who came to see the corpse. And many of the ladies and gentlemen inquired for me, and when I was pointed out to them, commended my conduct and fidelity in discovering the authors of the murder, condoled me for having suffered innocently, and several gave me money. One old lady who came in a pretty carriage drawn by 2 black horses gave me $1. On Monday, the funeral took place, and several hundred persons followed the corpse to the grave, over which a minister delivered a short sermon. The young gentleman who was with me when we found the deceased on the island walked with her mother to the grave yard, and the little brother followed with a younger sister. Last paragraph. After the intermittent, wines and refreshments were handed round the whole assembly, and at least 100 persons remained for dinner with my master's family. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the carriages and horses were ordered to the door of the courtyard of the house, and the company retired. At sundown, the plantation was quiet as if peace had never been disturbed. And that is the end. It was a long chapter, but it was like a little mini series up in that chapter. I want to thank everybody for joining us for the reading of 50 Years in Chains. If you can believe it, we're up to chapter 10. The book has 20 chapters. So we have another 10 chapters to go. Very interesting. You're seeing, for me, I don't know if anybody's on the line, but you're seeing a level of, even in the face of danger, even in the face of a lot of things, he subscribes to being truthful. He subscribes to being upholding truth in the face of danger. So he tries to exonerate himself by, following the people in the woods and then actually trusting those who just tried to kill him. And bringing water. This dude here, I told you, he's kind of like Joseph. He brings water to the guy who admittedly says that we framed you. This is an interesting man right here. He's not an everyday I would say everyday, the mind of an everyday enslaved individual. He has a level that he's operating based on his story that I just think is interesting. I would really like to see, what becomes of him. To be able to go ahead and trust the people who are afflicting you to do what's right. When, as we see that they had a crazy level of vigilante justice. Like they didn't even say, let's go and bethink ourselves. No, let's decide right now. And it's like, hey, we'll do it. And then that's how it went. And just to see that in this country, there was a high level of vigilante justice that took place in their minds, and that a lot of people, in their case, they were about to skin him in the beginning of the chapter. If we missed it, definitely this will be on the replay. But they was about to murder him, and that jump to pass judgment, and even in our lives, just that jump to pass judgment can really be dangerous, especially when we don't take time to search out all the facts. If the young man who was watching on didn't say no, this is not him, they would have killed him. They actually cut him and began to bleed him out, which is, just really hard to imagine. I know everybody's online. I think there's a chat on the side box. Let me see here if I can see. If you have anything to say, feel free to do so. If not, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Usually we have the commenters on the phone, but the phone was accidentally on mute, and I didn't realize that the phone was on mute. And so they hung over. So the ones who are listening online, definitely feel free to put your comments or your questions or just your feedback into the box, and I will let you know when we're coming back with part or chapter 10. I look forward to these readings because, like I said, I'm not reading ahead. And so it's kind of like, I'm with everybody else just to see what's going to happen next in this instant, not in this narrative here. So once again, thank everyone for tuning in. We're gonna come back tomorrow for the reading of chapter 10. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock for the reading of chapter 10. Thank you for spending the time with us. Feel free to share this along, and if you have young children around, and just introduce them to their history. Sometimes we have them sitting down watching all of these shows and things like this, but this is something, families, that we can just sit down and reintroduce the history and have conversations and return back to those things that will help us understand where we're coming from and who we are. So once again, my name is Amuni Israel. Thank you for joining me. This is the LEV Project, Lift Every Voice. And I look forward to hearing some readers, the voices of different readers. And I know they'll be coming soon. So I'll continue to hold up the fort till we do so. Until next time, everybody have a blessed night. Peace.